Welcome to the Pandora's Actor's Supercut, a consolidated version of every video I've ever made on him. So, if you're interested in who he is and how strong his build is, then stick around for a comprehensive breakdown of exactly that. Let's get started. I suppose that the most logical place to start would be with Ainz's personal life, back when he was just the player known as Momonga. After all, Pandora's Actor was created by Suzuki Satoru. This salaryman had spent most of his life as a loner. He didn't really have any friends in school, and that didn't change much when he joined the workforce either. He was quiet, shy, and not particularly opinionated or assertive. So nobody really went out of their way to interact with him in return. You could say that he languished in isolation. It's a fairly par-for-the-course description of your typical isekai protagonist. But this isolated lifestyle would eventually change as he played Yggdrasil more. Starting from his first encounter with Touch Me when the man rescued him from a large group of PKers that were hunting heteromorphs. You could say he was Momonga's literal knight in shining armor. So Touch Me, being one of the first people to willfully interact with Momonga, birthed the formation of a strong bond between the two. He had a fairly honest, benevolent, and welcoming nature that would pretty much make friends with anyone, whereas Momonga was just desperate for someone to relate with. After this, I guess, fateful encounter, they would soon meet and interact with many other heteromorphic players, and they would go on to establish a guild called Nine's Own Goal under Touch Me's leadership. Through this, Ainz would discover what it was like to have a group of close friends for the first time. Each member had their own perspectives, ideals, and opinions, and they had no problem sharing them. Momonga, not having a strong opinion of his own, didn't really have a passion to speak of, and he wasn't confident enough in his own ideas. Thus, he absorbed the passions and ideas of others like a sponge. Because of this lack of social skills, he became content with just watching from the sidelines as everyone else interacted. But that's not to say that they ignored him. No, he became a trusted member of the guild, and a close friend to basically everyone. Perhaps it was his quiet nature that molded him into a good listener that made guild members come to him with their own frustrations and personal problems. Regardless of the reason though, he found himself in a position where he was trusted to hear out disagreements and serve as this neutral mediator. One such disagreements between Touch Me and Ulbert resulted in the guild being reformed to Ainz Ul Gon, with Momonga as the leader, mostly due to the mutual respect that each of the founding members had for him. This led the guild into its golden era, where at its peak, they had 41 dedicated members that helped to maintain the guild's place in the top 10 rankings of Yggdrasil, and they would create what was reportedly known as the unconquerable guild base of Nazarick. Momonga, being the leader, was the glue that held all this together. However, it was at some point that real-life obligations prevented the guild members from spending as much time with the guild as they used to. Real life took over, and members began to drift away from their hardcore gaming lifestyles and became more casual players so that they could focus on the important things in their life, like their families or moving up the corporate ladder. Soon enough, members began to leave the guild one by one, usually handing over their inventory to the treasury or Momonga in the process. Momonga had expected this, but he still couldn't accept the pain in his heart of losing his dear friends. He held out hope that maybe one day at least some would return. But when the membership finally dwindled to nothing, he was despondent. He decided to go into full carry mode and grind as much gold and loot as possible just to try to keep the guild's finances afloat. Maintenance costs for a top 10 guild was certainly not a cheap endeavor. Also, out of nostalgia, he created golems with the appearance of guildmates to guard the treasures, each adorned with the gear of the members that they were likened to. It was this fondness of the good times that he had with his guildmates that would later become basically his only motivation in the New World. He protects and adores the NPCs because they remind him of his guildmates. He acts for the benefits of Nazarick because it was created by his guildmates. He crushes anyone who tries to use his guildmates' names against him. And it was this appreciation for his friends that motivated him to create his first and only NPC, the Guardian of the Treasury, Pandora's Actor. Let's talk a bit of history now. In Greek mythology, Pandora was the first woman to ever be created. The TLDR is that the Titan Prometheus had just stolen fire from Mount Olympus and gave it to humanity. Zeus decided to punish humanity by giving them their first woman, Pandora. She was presented as a gift to Epimetheus, Prometheus' brother, who, even though was warned not to take any gifts from the gods, still took her anyway and married her. She carried with her a jar, or box, which was also a gift from the gods, but she was unaware of its contents. Then, when curiosity got the best of her, instead of killing the cat, it just unleashed every known evil upon mankind. Yep, Zeus's grand punishment was a woman carrying all the evils to ever exist.
Am I the only one that finds it a little bit funny that this story basically names woman as the harbinger of all things evil? But setting the low-key misogyny of the ancient Greeks aside, Pandora's story is important because of the meaning that the phrase Pandora's box took on as a result of this myth. Later literary and artistic treatments of the mythology focused less on the woman herself and more on the nature of the evil that was unleashed. In some cases, the person to open the box was said to even be a man who was too curious for his own good. Nowadays, a Pandora's box is a gift that at first appears to be valuable, but is quickly revealed to be a disaster or curse, and to open up a Pandora's box is to unleash something chaotic, unpredictable, and usually disastrous. That said, the evil inside the Pandora's box is sometimes downplayed, and the emphasis is on the fact that many different unique things burst forth. The contents of Pandora's box could be the embodiment of diversity, chaos, and change, which, while often harmful, can still have an unexpectedly benign or positive outcome as well. It's not that change and diversity are necessarily bad, it's that they are unpredictable and therefore risky. Pandora's actor is a reflection of this motif. Much like how Pandora's box is a container of wildly diverse, unpredictable, and oftentimes downright evil things, Pandora's actor is someone who acts as or imitates a diverse array of evil creatures. It's a very creative use of the Pandora name to really nail everything that this NPC embodies. He's a part of the doppelganger race, and AniNews created him specifically so that he could transform into and imitate the capabilities and appearance of every single one of the guild members. But since the guild members liked the idea of role-playing as evil villains in the form of these very terrifying creatures, the guild itself could then be seen as a Pandora's box in its own right. Or at least that's what they'd like to be. Pandora's actor can then be seen as both this metaphorical and physical love letter to the guild and its members, an expression of the appreciation that AniNews had for all the time that he spent together with them. Of course, the other NPCs are extremely jealous of Pandora's actor, since he is the only creation of their supreme ruler. As for his design, AniNews actually didn't really have anything cohesive in mind. Whether the final result was intentional or accidental is a bit of a mystery. You see, AniNews is a very impulsive lateral thinker, meaning his mind likes to jump from one topic to the other in rapid succession, and he can sometimes confuse himself in the process. Pandora's personality was constructed in much the same manner, a collection of a random assortment of ideas based on how AniNews was feeling at the time. His intentions weren't really for the creation of some meticulously planned and masterfully crafted NPC. Of course, the underlying theme for Pandora's actor does relate very strongly to the Greek myth that the name derives from, so it is very possible that there was always this constant underthought. Unfortunately though, the random ideas that AniNews had while making Pandora ended up coming back to bite him, as he found his creation quite embarrassing and ridiculous when he met him for the first time. It's because, just like Tabula, AniNews also went through a bit of a Chunibu phase earlier in his life. Chunibu, or 8th grader syndrome, is a phase that frequently strikes kids approximately in the 8th grade, where they become obsessed with certain imagery and behavior that they consider cool. The obsession becomes so strong that they often feel the desire to emulate or pretend that they themselves are a part of what they're obsessing over. It could be thinking that you have hidden powers, dressing like you're from your favorite show, or even acting all edgy because you think that you have an over-the-top tragic backstory like Sasuke. It is, however, still just a phase, and it ends almost as soon as it begins, and the person in question looks back on it with feelings of embarrassment. So what exactly was it that AniNews obsessed over during this short-lived phase? Well, if you're an SJW, then prepare to be triggered because, in a word, it was Nazis. Now just wait a second, before you go get your pitchforks and say, boycott Overlord because AniNews is a f***ing Nazi, let's just calm down for a second and let me try to explain this. Alright, so I'm not exactly a history buff, but there's a bit of a thing that Japan has for Germany and Nazi imagery. And if we're pointing this out, I might as well point out that other Asian countries such as Taiwan, South Korea, and Indonesia do this as well. But don't go pointing your pitchforks at these countries yet either. To be fair, it's partly due to the fact that their education on World War II mostly focused on their relevance and impact that it had on the East, instead of the Holocaust or Nazi Germany in general. At least that's the way it was until you reached university. That's a very long time to go without being explicitly told about certain key historical events. So allow me to give you a quick refresher. Japan and Germany were allies during World War II. At the end of the war, while North America and Europe were dealing with the fallout of the Nazi death camps and then the rising tide of communism to the east, Japan was dealing with both the literal and metaphorical fallout of being hit by 2 nuclear bombs. Not only were they isolated from the atrocities committed by their allies, they were also undergoing cultural turmoil as a result of the massive loss of life. 3 things happened culturally as a result of this. First, they went from extremely imperialistic and nationalistic to extremely pacifistic and somewhat libertarian and capitalistic. Second, they began to imitate the culture of the nation that beat them so heavily in the war. In this case, it was America. Thirdly, they retained a low-key sense of wonderment and appreciation for their allies, Germany, who single-handedly almost conquered all of Europe and was only brought down by a 3-way alliance between the world's #1 powers at the time. Of course, different people and groups in Japan reacted in different ways. I'm not saying that these 3 things were dominant trends that took over all of Japan, nor were they the only things that happened as a result of the war. I'm just saying that these 3 things that did emerge are relevant to this explanation. So what I'm trying to say is that whereas the rest of the planet mostly remembers Nazi Germany for their World War II atrocities, Japan retains this impression of Germany, and America too, as these straight up badasses. And there's remnants of this fascination all throughout the anime culture. Like, why is the title to Girls on Panzer half English and half German? Why use the German word for tank instead of the Japanese word? Or why are there so many blonde-haired, blue-eyed foreign girls in anime? These are things that are different from ordinary Japanese culture, and things that are different are sometimes seen as exotic and cool, especially given how stiflingly secular Japanese traditionalism can be to many young people. But there are also even more on-the-nose examples. Now, in this next one, I'm not saying that Lelouch is Hitler. He's my favorite character in any show. But Lelouch's rise to power in Code Geass could be seen as an analogy to Hitler's. Yeah, their motivations and actions were different, but the underlying methods of how they rose to the spot of tyrannical dictator could be seen as similar. Then, for the blatantly obvious example, some people in Asia openly cosplay as Nazis. Though in Japan, it's a bit less common since adults tend to understand that it's culturally unacceptable. So yes, Pandora's actor's mannerisms are styled after a Nazi general, replete with a World War II era German SS officer trenchcoat. He even speaks a lot of German too, and tends to frequently be over the top and exaggerated with his behaviors. Ainz had thought that at the time, military uniforms were quite stylish and cool looking. He even decided that because Pandora's actor was supposed to be an actor, it would make sense for him to be very over the top and dramatic in his mannerisms. Unfortunately, Ainz could have never anticipated the fact that the random ideas that popped into his head about Pandora's actor's personality and appearance would ever come back to haunt him. As I'm sure you're well aware of now, the current Ainz finds Pandora's actor to be terribly embarrassing, and is very self-conscious of the fact that his guildmates might mock him for his creation. However, what you may not know is that his outward appearance, as ridiculous as it may be, is really just a sham. After all, he is an actor. His intelligence is said to rival that of Albedo and Demiurge, and although it's never specified precisely how his talents relate to theirs, he's said to have a very strange thought process. Just like Ainz, he's a lateral thinker who can see things from a variety of unusual perspectives, and thus he's quite good at picking up on things others fail to notice. But he often puts on a show of being dramatically surprised about things or being extremely passionate, not because he actually is, but it's because he was written to over-exaggerate everything that he does. He is also one of the only NPCs who openly questions Ainz's orders. It's not because he's disloyal. In fact, of all the NPCs in Nazarick, he's probably the most loyal to Ainz, since most NPCs will choose to follow the orders of their creator over that of the remaining Supreme One. He questions Ainz's orders in order to understand what he's thinking and why he does things, so that he himself can carry out the orders better. As such, his relationship with Ainz is very relaxed, cordial, and impersonal, and he takes liberties that other Guardians wouldn't dare to. The respect and adoration towards a supreme being is still there, but Ainz finds it tough to maintain his commanding Overlord persona when with Pandora's actor. Ainz frequently uses the analogy that the NPCs are the children of their creators, and it's not just illustrative either, that's actually how he views them. They each have various personality quirks that are reminiscent of the guild members that he once spent so much time with. When Pandora hears this, he takes to this label wholeheartedly and starts calling Ainz father. It's often theorized that Pandora's actor is the only person in Nazarick who really understands Ainz. He seems to be somewhat aware of the fact that Ainz finds the expectations that are placed upon him by the rest of the servants to be stifling and stressful, and so perhaps he chooses to take a more relaxed approach because of this. Pandora's actor, just like all the other NPCs, take after their creators in many ways that aren't specified in their lore or backstory. So perhaps deep down inside, beneath the mask and his acting, Pandora's actor feels the same way that Ainz does. A lonely soul that's desperate for a friend to truly connect with. And just maybe this is the reason why he's able to understand Ainz the best, and why he can be so informal in his presence. Now, normally I'd put his responsibilities as an area guardian in the next video, but his role in Nazarick plays a lot into his lore, so let's talk a bit about it now. As I said in the beginning of the video, Pandora's actor is the area guardian of the treasury, the place where all the guild members' equipment are enshrined, and they sit as a testament to all the guild's glory and accomplishments. Area guardians are not to be confused with floor guardians. Just as the name implies, floor guardians are in charge of an entire floor, whereas area guardians are given dominion over a specific area within a floor. Normally, area guardians are the lesser powerful of the two, but that's not always the case, as there are plenty other NPCs within Nazarick that can go toe-to-toe with floor guardians given the right circumstances. Alongside his role as an area guardian, Pandora's actor was also written to be the treasurer with a mindset of being absolutely obsessed with cataloging and categorizing all of the magical items within it. He also just loves handling magical items in general, looking at them, admiring them, polishing the armor, sharpening the weapons, you know, that sort of thing. I mean, it only makes sense that someone who spends all day sitting around in the treasury should be doing so because they actually enjoy it. From this, Pandora's actor knows everything about every item in the treasury, including its capabilities, how best to use them, what they are worth, and so on. He's also generally responsible for any sequence involving finances of the treasury. Presumably, he works alongside Albedo to ensure that Nazarick's finances and expenses are kept in good standing. But his more regular duties entailed preparing the money necessary for operating and controlling Nazarick's defense networks. However, after arriving in the New World, out of the fear that Nazarick's finite supply of gold would be exhausted, Ainz had ordered the bulk of the defense network to be shut down, so he generally doesn't have that much to do. Given Ainz's efforts to make Pandora's actor capable of imitating the appearance and capabilities of every one of the guild members, he could very much reliably fill the shoes of almost any guardian, and would make an excellent and versatile servant. But because of Ainz's embarrassment, he remains locked in the treasury. Fortunately, since no guardians had permission to enter or would dare to do so behind Ainz's back, and almost no other guardian knew of his existence, Ainz could just pretend that he didn't exist for a while. But eventually, once word of Pandora's actor spread to Demiurge and the other guardians, they began to recommend that Ainz make more use of his abilities,
which we'll get more into right now.
If we start with his build, Pandora's actor has 45 levels dedicated to racial classes, with 15 in Doppelganger, 10 more in Greater Doppelganger, then the remaining 20 are unknown. Just like all the other heteromorphic races, being a Doppelganger gives you access to a full racial class tree, and you gain the ability to choose from a multitude of subvariants as you level. So Doppelganger would seem to be the first, then Greater Doppelganger after that. And beyond that, in the remaining unknown 20 levels, is a possibility of even more powerful variants. As I'm throwing the word doppelganger around, there is the chance that many of you may not even know what a doppelganger is, so allow me to give you a bit of insight into the term. The word originates from mid-19th century Germany as a descriptive term for paranormal apparitions, or beings, that appear identical to another living person. The word itself is a combination of two nouns, with doppel meaning double and ganger meaning walking. In this classical sense, a doppelganger isn't someone that transforms as we're familiar with. It's closer to a creature that was born as an identical clone. But as a popular term in fantasy games, it's frequently used to refer to mythological creatures who can adopt the form of others. Though they aren't just mere shapeshifters who can assume an alternate form. They actively mimic other individuals, typically for nefarious purposes, meaning that not only can they transform into other creatures and imitate their appearance, but they can also copy their capabilities. Special attacks, spells, racial abilities. In their new form, a doppelganger has access to pretty much anything the original has access to. This is no mere lookalike. No, this is a full-on transformation. When transformed, they gain all the benefits and drawbacks of their new form, as if their new form was their regular. Both racial weaknesses and racial advantages are adopted, and their base stats are even adjusted to be equivalent to the original. The only thing a doppelganger can't imitate is special equipment and gear. While they can look as if they are wearing the gear if need be, this is merely for appearances only, and they don't gain any of its benefits or stat boosts. That being said, the doppelganger can always simply wear the equipment in question if they can somehow obtain it. As a matter of fact, doppelgangers can bypass any race or class restrictions on the gear in question. Some gear can only be worn by, say, dwarves or birdmen. Some weapons can only be wielded by warriors, others only by mages. But a doppelganger can ignore all these limitations and restrictions, though it's not clear whether they innately ignore all restrictions regardless of what form they assume, or whether they have to assume the form of a being with a particular race or class in order to utilize particular pieces of equipment restricted to that race or class. Now, as I go on to further speak of the finer details of the doppelganger race, just remember that they all apply to Pandora's actor. Though I may not be talking about him explicitly, it's still just as relevant. So moving on, doppelgangers, unlike shapeshifters, must imitate a specific form belonging to someone else. They cannot make modifications to the form, nor can they create their own, meaning it has to be a form belonging to someone else, and it can only be imitated exactly. It's possible that they must first witness, meet, or study the individual in question before they can transform into them. But a doppelganger's imitation is moderately dependent upon the perception that others have on the form that they've chosen. Once transformed, a doppelganger actively reads the surface thoughts of those who knew the person being imitated, and it uses that to subtly adjust its behavior and appearance to match the expectations that they have. And when I say surface thoughts, I'm actually referring to a limited telepathy effect that doesn't quite go to the extent of reading a person's past memories or really accessing their subconscious, but it's more simply listening to the voice in their head, their surface thoughts. Thus, a doppelganger is ironically most effective against the people who knew that person extremely well, since they would have the most accurate perceptions. It's quite the interesting tactic to refine one's imitation, and I'm sure Pandora's actor excels at it given his high-level genius. Now, being aware of this basic telepathy, it's not really surprising that the greatest threat to a doppelganger is a crowd or party, as it may have difficulty melding all of their expectations together or discerning which individuals have the most reliable and accurate understanding of the person that they're meant to imitate. If everyone in a large group hates them out of prejudice rather than personal first-hand experience, they may act out of character in an attempt to reinforce that prejudice. Then, close friends who later hear of the events might grow suspicious that their buddy was acting all weird. Even more so, since the reading of surface thoughts is a form of attack, it can be resisted or outright negated by immunities, such as Ainz's passive undead immunity to mind-affecting attacks. Now you may be wondering, how the hell did this work in the world of Yggdrasil? Cause the last time I checked, video games didn't let you listen to people's thoughts. Well, all of this was merely a footnote in the bestiary lore entry in the game, but after having migrated to the New World, it became an active and functional mechanic. Presumably, in the game, you could use doppelgangers to imitate other players to trick their friends and guildmates, or to beat certain quests, or even just as a versatile generalist who can cover multiple roles. Let's shift to a bigger question now. Who and what exactly can a doppelganger imitate at each level? A standard doppelganger, which maxes out at 15 levels, can imitate any creature up to level 40. A greater doppelganger, which maxes out at an additional 10 levels, can imitate any creature up to level 60. Incidentally, you can distinguish between the two based on the number of fingers that they have on each hand in their doppelganger form. Greater doppelgangers have 4, and regular doppelgangers have 3. And since Pandora's actor is able to imitate creatures up to level 100, namely all of the supreme ones, there are presumably more powerful doppelganger types, and once again, presumably, that's what the rest of his 20 or so racial levels are dedicated to, though he still only has 4 fingers per hand. Perhaps there's a hidden doppelganger level above these ones that maxes out at 5 levels, similar to Ainz's Overlord. Maybe something like an Ultra or Super doppelganger. Even a lesser doppelganger below the standard one would allow us to make more sense of this. I mean, the possibility seems relatively balanced. If a lesser doppelganger requires 15 levels, then it can imitate creatures up to level 20. Then the standard would require another 15 racial levels and bring us up to 30, while allowing for imitations up to level 40. Then the greater doppelganger would bring us up to 40 racial levels, while allowing for an imitation up to level 60. And finally, the super ultra doppelganger, which costs another 5 racial levels, brings us to Pandora's 45, and would allow for that imitation up to any level. Alternatively, perhaps the first 60 levels are just relatively easy to imitate, and the remaining 40 require certain specializations to achieve. For instance, There could very well be doppelganger variants or subtypes that are specialized towards improving specific forms over others. If that was the case, then there's probably a doppelganger subrace that specializes in imitating heteromorphs, and can break past that normal level limit of 60 that greater doppelgangers have. But once again, only when imitating heteromorphs due to that special subvariant. Though this is just speculation. Those last 20 racial levels could very well be anything, but given the fact that he can imitate level 100 beings, we can be certain that it is some kind of doppelganger. Now, you might be thinking, doppelgangers sound incredibly broken, but there are actually a good deal of limitations and drawbacks. Obviously, I've already explained the weaknesses of being unable to replicate equipment, and as it is with any MMO, equipment can change everything. Just look at Ainz's fight with Sheltier.
Be gone, son!
So, by default, a doppelganger is much less capable than what they're imitating unless they already have comparable equipment for themselves. Another potential limitation could be the number of transformations permitted per day, though it's not too clear whether one actually exists, or if there's even a time limit on the duration of the transformation itself. But most special abilities like this do impose some kind of threshold. This is important for two reasons. First, if you have to switch repeatedly or use up time, you may eventually run out, and you'll become stuck in a particular form for an extended period of time, or even revert to your lesser doppelganger form. Second, there are actually certain spells that can revert or disable a doppelganger's shapeshifting ability. We're not given any specific name or their level, but apparently Ainz knows that a few of them exist. Lower leveled variations simply revert them to their doppelganger form, forcing them to spend time and potentially one of their limited daily uses to transform back. While stronger variations not only revert them, they also disable further transformations for an extended amount of time. And doppelgangers in their base form are quite weak, much weaker than similar units of their level. So during the time that they're in their doppelganger form, they're actually quite vulnerable and pretty useless. Of course, wasting time to cast such a spell on a hunch that a person that you're with is actually a doppelganger can give your enemy the advantage, so it's not very practical to use it every fight. Okay, so it may seem like a nice exploit to create an army of level 45 doppelganger NPCs and have them go around imitating level 100 guards, but if you were to fight a foe that knows or suspects that your army is made up of doppelgangers, a single spell can turn your army into a giant XP farm. Though it's highly doubtful that anyone in the New World knows or has access to such spells, so Pandora's actor himself should be fine. Furthermore, though not confirmed, I suspect that there's an additional limitation placed on doppelgangers, namely that they can't transform into anything that's a higher level than they are. Also, it would seem that by extrapolating a bit of information from the light novel, the total number of forms that a doppelganger has access to seems to be dependent on their level. Though, once again, it's not stated explicitly in the light novel. It's not as if they can just copy anyone they've ever seen at any time. They only have a limited number that they can choose from at any given moment. As a matter of fact, since Nabe only has one form other than her normal doppelganger appearance and one level of doppelganger, while Pandora's actor has 45 forms and 45 levels of we assume to be doppelganger, from this, it would seem that you gain one additional form for each level of doppelganger that you obtain. Naturally, you'd assume that these weren't permanent choices that took up a transformation slot forever, but whether you could swap them out for others or not is still not clear. I mean, it wouldn't really make sense to not be able to swap out forms, especially if you're leveling up early on in the game and have a low-level form that you want to replace with a stronger one. After all, Yggdrasil did have a global respec mechanic, and you can use that to quickly remove 5 levels that you didn't like. You could very easily gain those 5 levels back relatively quickly due to the way that XP was tuned. Most players got to level 100 pretty fast, and the bulk of your power was dependent on gear, build, and tactics, so players didn't really mind dying as a method of respecking. So if there actually was no method of replacing old forms that you didn't like with new ones manually, then you could simply die and lose access to 5 forms along with the 5 levels that you lost. Of course, this option isn't so easily mimicked in the New World. You don't just automatically respawn back in some kind of safe zone. You have to be resurrected with a spell of at least level 5 or higher, and very few denizens outside of Nazarick have access to such spells. The last and probably most important limitation is that a doppelganger's imitation isn't perfect. While they can imitate all of the abilities of a creature, their efficacy with said abilities is reduced relative to the original. I'm going to be pulling out a few numbers right now, so I'll try to make this as easily digestible as possible. But specifically, while a greater doppelganger can imitate creatures up to level 60, its actual abilities are only around 80 to 90% as potent as the original. For example, Pandora's actor can imitate the guild members of Ain's Ul Gom, a selection of level 100 creatures, but with only 80% of their potency. Base stats such as HP, MP, physical attack, magical defense, magical defense, agility, and resistances are changed to be equal to the original. But the actual output of any special ability or attack is 20% less. Now, at first glance, that doesn't seem like a significant drawback. A 20% penalty in exchange for being able to imitate 45 different creatures seems reasonable. You can be an ultra-specialized crafter, or a spellcaster, or a warrior with a perfectly optimal and hyper-specialized build, then fill basically any role, but also be able to ignore any downsides or limitations at will by transforming into something else. And all it costs is a measly 20% potency reduction. Right? Well, it's not quite as simple as it sounds. First of all, it's hard to predict what a 20% reduction in attack power or defense actually leads into in terms of damage output or survivability. After all, attack power and defense interact with each other. So let's take a look at a simple example and do some quick maths. Say my special attack does 1000 damage per hit, and my defensive skill blocks 800 damage. If I was fighting someone with identical stats to myself, I'd do 200 damage per hit to them, and they'd deal 200 damage to me. But if I'm fighting against a doppelganger with only 80% potency on their skills identical to mine, then that means the total damage they do with their attack is 800, and their defensive skill is now only able to block 640 damage. If they were to hit me now, their 800 damage goes up against my 800 defense and does 0 damage each hit, whereas if I hit them, my 1000 attack versus their 640 defense means I now do 360 damage per hit. Consider for a moment the implications of that. A mere 20% debuff means that they'll now take 80% more damage than if they weren't a doppelganger but still had identical stats to me. And their 20% lower attack means they'll essentially do no damage, and I'm standing here laughing like Kirito on that bridge. So from this basic example, we see a 20% difference in the input leads to a well over 80% difference in the output. While Yggdrasil probably operates on a much more complicated damage formula, as most games tend to do, since we don't know exactly what it is, it's extremely difficult to determine what 20% lower potency actually translates to. You can apply a similar logic to a lot of other things. For instance, what does 80% potency mean when applied to things like instant death spells? Does it reduce the chances of success? If so, how does that work? What's the formula for calculating the chances of inflicting a negative status effect on an opponent? Does it scale based on a spell potency variable, which is reduced by an enemy's resistance or agility stat? So if I go from 1000 spell potency to 800 spell potency versus the enemy's 900 resistance stat, then what are the chances that my debuff is now successful? Perhaps it could be something as simple as if I initially had a 50% chance of causing instant death, then an 80% potency would reduce that to a 40% chance because of the way that probabilities work. There's just a whole bunch of variables that need to be considered. For the sake of simplicity, let's just assume that the actual overall output of any activity will work out to be 80% of the original, meaning a fixed 20% penalty on whatever, regardless of the situation. So when Pandora's actor uses a defensive skill, it's only around 80% as good at reducing damage. When he attacks, he's only doing 80% as much damage. When he's trying to dodge or resist a spell, he's only dodging it 80% as often. When he's trying to inflict a debuff or crowd control, he's only successful 80% as often. And when he tries to heal, he only heals for 80% as much damage. And that's that. So how significant are all those penalties in a fight? Well, in my initial example, you saw for yourself by the numbers how much of a difference that 20% really makes. Which leads us into the next question. What if a doppelganger gets into a fight with its original? With the two of them trading special attacks back and forth while trying to block and dodge with special abilities. Well, since the doppelganger would only deal around 80% as much damage on offense, and would negate around 80% damage on defense, the total penalty would actually come out to be 64%, since they're applied to separate aspects of the fight. The penalties stack, meaning there's the less damage he does overall, in combination with the increased damage that he's taking. So to answer the question, by the math, you can fight a doppelganger of yourself and easily beat it with more than a third of your HP left. That said, this example is heavily abstracted, simplified, and generalized. It assumes a very simple fight where they take turns slapping each other with attacks and constantly trying to block or dodge. It doesn't factor in tactics or strategy or special abilities, which could swing the fight radically in one direction or another. Even if you are weaker, if you can ambush your enemy, then it doesn't matter nearly as much. I also don't factor in the impact of crowd control or disables. Hell, Ainz himself has spells which instantly kill the target if they aren't resisted. Like, if you're dead, you can't fight anymore. Of course, the key to figuring all of this out would be what exactly 80% potency means in these cases. Furthermore, there's nothing stopping a doppelganger from changing into a form that gives it a significant advantage over the person it's imitating. And there's a lot of different situations where penalties to particular stats aren't nearly as important. If you transform into a stealthy archer or a ranged attacker and snipe them from a distance while in stealth, you might just be able to get multiple hits off and outright kill them before they can even react. Or you can just rain down artillery on them using heavy bombardment magic. If you're just planning on doing these hit and run tactics, it doesn't matter nearly as much that you have less defensive abilities than someone else. The only thing that really matters in that type of situation is that you do less damage. And it's not like you even need to use a doppelganger to fight. They can imitate craftsmen to build and smith gear, then switch to alchemy and build and make lots of powerful potions, then switch over to a divination build and recon the enemy, then switch to a commander that's built to buff everyone, and then switch back to a combat build to actually fight. Of course, they'll just be 20% worse at these things, whatever that means. But as you can tell, there's definitely a lot of things that need to be considered when talking about this reduced potency effect of imitation. Once again, how does it apply to buffs and disables? Does it reduce both the magnitude of the effect and the duration? What about the number of uses or the MP cost? And what about healing? What does it really look like if I only heal 80% as much as a properly built healer? Does that just mean that I have to spend more mana to heal that same amount of HP? Those of you who have ever played an MMO know that it's not that simple. Put aside the complicated considerations of overhealing and MP sustain for just a second. You know that if you can't keep pace with the incoming damage as a healer, a single person dropping can lead to a chain reaction of events that just results in a devastating party wipe. Anyway, my whole point regarding all of this is that penalties can actually stack together in unexpected ways and end up being a lot more significant than just 20%. A doppelganger could be massively inferior, or just slightly worse than whatever specialist that they happen to be imitating. It's all situational. But at the end of the day, what a doppelganger sacrifices in raw capability, they make up for in versatility and flexibility. Their form of imitation can round out any party or fill any role. Mechanically speaking, they're less suited for established guilds and more for solo play or pickup groups. Their use in something like guild combat is exactly what you expect, for deception. They look and play close enough to the original that they can fool the unsuspecting. You can make your forces look more powerful than they really are by mixing in NPC doppelgangers. You could imitate your opponents and trick their friends and guildmates into giving you intel or free stuff. Yggdrasil is a game of information and deception. Ambushes, tactics, and strategy matter a lot more than just raw power. As we focus more on Pandora's actor specifically, we should look at his level breakdown once again. As previously mentioned, it was 15 levels in Doppelganger, 10 levels in Greater Doppelganger, and 20 more unknown, assumed to be more Doppelganger variants or subtypes. This gives him a total of 45 different transformations, and if our theory from the last video is correct, that means that Pandora's actor has 46 forms in total, each of the 41 members of Ainz Ooal Gown, his ordinary Doppelganger form, and then 4 more mystery forms. What are they, you might ask? Well, nobody knows. They could be literally anything, or even nothing. Perhaps Ainz just never picked anything and left them open as wildcard slots. As for his known transformations, well, there's a large list of Ainz Ooal Gown members whose races, builds, and roles in the guild were relatively well known and well defined. And I don't think it would be a proper explained video if I didn't briefly cover each of them. Just keep in mind though, As I summarize their build and skills with a bunch of one-liners, Pandora's actor can fully replicate them when imitating their form, making whatever they specialized in his own specialty. So in his selection of transformations, he first has Momonga, the skeletal necromancer and death magic specialist, whose dark wisdom skill has allowed him to learn 700 different spells, making him the most flexible and versatile mage in the guild. Touch Me, the insectoid paladin, the strongest 1v1 fighter of the guild and the one who held the title and class of world champion, marking him amongst the strongest in the entire game. Nishikiyan Rai, the half-golem ninja who specialized in one-shot kill assassinations delivered from stealth, and he was adept at stealth operations and reconnaissance. Warrior Take Mikazuchi, the Nephilim samurai who specialized in attacks with large charge-up times that inflicted massive damage. He also loved creating and customizing katanas. Amano Mahitotsu, the crustacean blacksmith. He led the guild's crafters and adventured around collecting rare materials. Pero Ronchino, the birdman sniper that specialized in ultra-long ranged combat and could snipe people across open ground from 2 kilometers out. If you're wondering, this would be the type of character that I'd like to play as. Bukubuku Chagama, the slime commander, who led raids and expeditions as well as was an expert in aggro management as the indomitable frontline tank. She was also one of the only 3 female members of the guild. Hirohiro, the elder black ooze monk that specialized in dissolving the enemy's equipment to render it useless. Tabula Smaragdina, the brain-eater alchemist, an adept spellcaster who also dabbled in the creation of alchemical items and potions. Punito Moe, the death vine strategist. He led and instructed the guild members in its PvP and guild versus guild endeavors, as well as was an expert in military strategy. Ulbert Elaine Odal, the demon archsage, known for extremely flashy and powerful damage spells which could outstrip even super tier spells, but also at the cost of draining most of his mana instantly. Yamaiko, the Nephilim spiritualist, who had the most powerful healing spells of the entire guild and could fill the role of an off-tank in emergencies. She was another of the 3 female members of the guild. Now, as we go through more of the guild members, we get to the ones whose class, race, or build details were only briefly mentioned, but never thoroughly explained. So out of these we have Blue Planet, a druid which probably entailed either nature-related spells or summons, incorporating magical plants and creatures. Bell River, a magic knight who fought with a mix of swordplay, spells, and buffs. He was a jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none type character. Variable Talisman, a frontline tank that was around as good in that role as Bukubuku Chagama. Tigris Euphrates, who was a ranger or thief of some kind, so he was skilled at reconnaissance and enjoyed adventuring. Flatfoot, an assassin who was also personally skilled in reconnaissance and anti-stealth operations, despite his build not being focused around it. Nyarata, a merchant and appraisal-related specialist. And finally, Nubo, a divination specialist that could detect magical surveillance and infiltrators, allowing him to spy on others and protect the guild from being spied on. The other 22 members are either only known by name or just completely unknown. The 12 that do have names are Ankara Mochimochi, Beast King Mekongoa, White Brim, Ancient One, Wish 3, Suratan, Temperance, Garnet, Shijuten Suzaku, Lucifer, Genjiro, and Kuderas, which leaves a further 10 members whose names and identities have yet to be mentioned. Now knowing this information, it's a good time to highlight the connection these transformations have to his role as the area guardian of the treasury, the place where all the guild members' equipment was enshrined, marking the treasury as a domain that is highly tailored and synergistic to Pandora's actor's abilities. Being able to transform into any of the guild members, as well as being located in the room where all their equipment and weapons are stored, pretty much marks the treasury as Pandora's actor's personal inventory. He could make use of any of the guild equipment lying around on the various statues. As I said last video, though he can transform into the guild members and mimic their capabilities, he can't mimic the physical equipment. He can only bypass the racial and class restrictions, meaning that he needs to equip the gear himself in order to use it. So, in the event of an invasion, he'd have easy access to all the guild's most valuable and powerful items. Though if invaders did somehow manage to reach the treasury, the statues that stand there were already designed to come to life and attack any intruders that attempted to breach this area. Specifically, anyone wearing the Ring of Ainz Uogon who could just teleport in and attempt to loot it. It was assumed during their design that only intruders would not know the ring needed to be removed before entering the treasury. But In the off chance an enemy did teleport into it and was able to destroy the statues bearing the equipment of guild members past, perhaps in that case, Pandora's actor could swoop in, transform into that respective guild member, and engage the invaders in combat with those same items. It's not like he wouldn't be proficient with these items either. Remember, Pandora's actor knows everything about every item in the treasury, including their capabilities and how best to use them. So basically, the home field advantage he gets from being in the treasury means you really don't want to fight him there. But the odds of that ever happening in the new world are very, very slim. So as of late, AniNews has been giving Pandora's actor jobs that are actually related to his transformation ability, and not just keeping him locked up all day in the treasury counting coins or polishing armor. Specifically, Pandora's actor has seen frequent use, both in the anime and light novel, as AniNews' body double. In the final episode of Season 3, it was Pandora's actor who was disguised as Momo. You could tell by his signature dramatic flair and the dialogue that he has with Albedo. But there were other situations as well. You may not have realized this, but when AniNews was interrogating Sibas about his suspicious behavior back in Season 2, this was also Pandora's actor in disguise. The clues are all there if you rewatch it with this in mind. The most obvious is when he recognizes Suare as being Nina's sister. It's only after he teleports away and then returns that he notices that Suare bears a striking resemblance to the girl that he adventured with in the Swords of Darkness back in Season 1. This is because Pandora's actor only swaps out with AniNews after they verified that Sibas is loyal to Nazarick. After all, as a level 100 NPC, Sibas might have been able to assassinate or at least grievously wound AniNews at the cost of his own life out of desperation. There's also a striking contrast between AniNews' mannerisms before and after he teleports. He uses very derogatory language to talk about Suare when we first see him, but when he returns, he's back to his normal, more composed self. Incidentally, fans have noticed that there's an important visual clue that you can use to determine whether or not Pandora's actor is copying AniNews. Apparently, the red dots in AniNews' eyes disappear. Doppelganger transformations should be perfect, at least in appearance. So perhaps this was an artistic decision to give the impression that AniNews was not acting himself. But all this transformation talk is still related to the usage of his racial class levels. If we shift focus over to his 55 extra job class levels, we see that 35 of them are known. He has 10 levels in Expert, 10 levels in Craftsman, and 15 in Lord of a Castle, with the remaining 20 unknown. From this, it should become more obvious what AniNews was going for with such a build. If you recall, when a doppelganger is in their original form, their doppelganger levels are basically useless. They don't have very good stats and they have no special abilities except for the transformation itself. And when a doppelganger transforms, their entire build changes. This means Pandora's actor loses access to his levels in Craftsman, Expert, and Lord of a Castle whenever he switches forms. So basically, there's no point in trying to make a specialized build with the remaining 55 levels. You're not going to be able to create a proper dedicated crafter or thief or whatever when you only have 55 levels to work with. If you want something like that, you're going to want to transform into it. And it's not like you can even use these 55 spare levels to supplement or improve whatever you're transforming into. You only get to use them when you're in your weak doppelganger form. In fact, there's probably not even a point in leveling anymore at all. Knowing that those 55 levels are useless is partly why I think that the maximum level of your transformations depend on your overall character level. AniNews is pretty thrifty, and I don't see him throwing away some of Nazarick's limited custom NPC levels just for fun. It could very well be necessary to level up to 100 in order to mimic level 100 characters. So if you have to level something, you might as well spread things out, dip into a bunch of different things, and go for a non-combat pure utility build that would be useful when Pandora's actor isn't transformed. This was probably what AniNews had intended when choosing these job classes. Craftsman being the first should be self-evident. It lets him create and repair equipment. That said, enchanting equipment with magic abilities requires an enchanter-style class, so it's not like he was going around crafting divine class gear. He would need a much heavier investment in multiple spellcasting and crafting-oriented classes to make competitive high-level equipment. Most likely, AniNews intended for him to use those levels to maintain the weapons and armor in the treasury. He could also have it for lore reasons. After all, he's supposed to be obsessed with handling magical equipment. But there could be practical reasons too. Perhaps equipment degraded over time, even if it wasn't being used. and so regular maintenance was necessary, even if you did leave it lying around all day in the treasury. Then we have the Expert class, which is actually one from Dungeons & Dragons. It allows the user to invest heavily in any skills of their choosing, but provides no major combat benefits aside from a very minimal stat increase. An expert in Dungeons & Dragons can be an expert in basically anything the user wants them to be. They can be used to improve existing skills, add new ones to their repertoire that they didn't have before, or any mix of the two. Assuming that the author was borrowing from Dungeons & Dragons as he's done in the past, this is probably the purpose of an expert in Yggdrasil as well. Now, Lord of a Castle is the last and least obvious of the three. It seems to be one of the basic classes since it maxes out at level 15, meaning that it was widely available to everyone and had relatively basic abilities that could be improved by more specialized variants. We have two things in mind as to what benefits it may bring. First, it kinda brings to mind the idea of a defense commander, doesn't it? You know, that person in command of all the troops when a castle is being besieged. If so, Lord of the Castle might be a commander type class that specializes in defending a defined area, meaning they would provide area of effect buffs to any unit within a specific building or structure, including ones as large as a castle. After all, the treasury is guarded by those sentries that resemble the supreme ones, and they were designed to attack any trespasser. So a practical use case would be where Pandora's actor could quickly buff all of these sentries before transforming into one of the supreme ones to engage any intruders. I doubt you had to pick one specific castle too. You could probably change the target area, but it would just take a long time to do so. Furthermore, in exchange for the lack of mobility, the buffs could be much higher than the other similarly powered commander classes. The only problem with this theory is that it sounds more like a specialized commander type class, one of the types that maxes out at level 10, instead of one of the broad generalist level 15 ones. Our second theory is that a Lord of a Castle could be the most basic form of a type of noble-esque class. These were the administrators and rulers of a region. Nobles are adept at dealing with large sums of money, and they can collect tax from those within their domain, and perhaps even raise conscripts. Maybe a Lord of a Castle passively generates money over time based on the value of the surrounding terrain or its population. Or maybe they're good at negotiating deals so they get discounts on the money they spend. This would be unlike a general merchant class, who would gain discounts for both buying and selling. Perhaps they also have access to summons or discounts on mercenary vassals. The main reason that I like this theory is that in this context, a Lord of a Castle seems like it could be the least powerful of the noble type classes, which fits since it caps at level 15. I mean, you're just lord of a single castle, right? You're not exactly a baron with vast swaths of land and multiple lords underneath you, let alone something as powerful as a king. This idea of Pandora's actor as some kind of passive gold generator makes the most sense to me though. Ainz had 55 levels to burn, and Pandora's actor was going to spend most of his time mulling around in the treasury, so why not have him passively generate gold or something? Though it's not clear when Pandora's actor was created, Ainz did spend a large amount of his time power farming gold to maintain Nazarick once the rest of the guild members had quit. Maybe he thought that Pandora's actor could help lighten the burden and generate some gold on his own. In fact, this might explain where those other 20 levels went to. It's not unreasonable to think that he spent 10 levels each on other lord classes in order to generate more gold. Or in general, there should be classes related to gaining, handling, or saving money. And you'd think that as the treasurer, Pandora's actor should have levels in those classes. So in a nutshell, when Pandora's actor isn't transforming into one of the supreme ones, he's repairing equipment, spending money at a discount, and maybe even buffing others or producing small quantities of gold out of thin air. In a fight though, he's somewhat weak relative to other high-level combat-oriented NPCs, like Shaltir or Cocytus, even with his ability to imitate lots of the power gamer builds of the supreme ones. It's that 80% potency that hits him hard. What he offers instead is boundless versatility and a knack for deception. Combine this with his intelligence that's set to rival both Demiurge and Albedo, and you've got yourself an ally that's suited to literally any situation. And that's everything about Pandora's actor.
If you made it all the way to the end, then please do let me know in the comments. Also, don't forget that the Succube merch is still available, and I do talk about Overlord every week on Twitch. So, if you want to check either of those out, then feel free to do so through the links in the description. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!